Hello, my name is Vanessa Andreotti. I am a professor of global education at the University of Oulu in Finland, in the north of Finland. This series of lectures about global education are part of a project for teachers. It's a course for teachers that is organized in partnership with the NGO Mondo Global Education Center. Now, before I start, I will say a little bit about me and why I work with global education. I am living currently in Finland, but before that I was in Canterbury, at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Before that I was at the University of Nottingham in England and the University of Ireland in Ireland. But I was born and raised in Brazil in a mixed heritage family where my mom is from Brazil. My dad's family is from Germany. My children travel on a Portuguese passport, and my husband is from Canada. So that's part of the reason why global education is in my blood, I think, and in my journey. And in all these different contexts, I have been working with schools, with teachers, and with other academics, also doing research on the complexities of teaching about globalization and about diversity in schools in contemporary societies. So that's part of the reason why I work with global education. Trying to raise children who are immigrants is also part of the reason why this area is so important for me, and you will see that probably reflected in the presentations. I'll try to bring a little bit of the stories in the presentation to make it more concrete. So it's a pleasure to be here talking to you. I hope one day we can meet face to face. But unfortunately and fortunately, we have this amazing technology that makes it possible for us to be learning together in this context. So I hope you have a great course and that what I'm offering to you provides some food for thought and for discussions. So today we're going to be talking about just in general about global education and some of the complexities and the debates around the idea of interdependence. Now, I'm going to start with a very basic concept of global education. But before I say that, the symbol that you see on the right-hand corner of the screen is a pause symbol. And this pause symbol is there because some of the slides will invite you to stop and think and share and discuss things with somebody. If you're watching this on your own, it's an invitation for you to stop and think. If you're watching it in a group, then it's an invitation to stop and discuss. So when you see that in the screen, please pause if you want the presentation so that you can have some time to share. So back to the presentation. I'm going to start with a very basic definition of global education where I try to combine many different aspects of this concept. And my definition that I use today, it's a working definition. Global education is defined differently in different contexts. So there's not one big definition of it. This is the definition that I'm going to show you, is the definition that I use that makes sense in my context. So this definition is about three different dimensions of global education, which is the self, the other, and local and global contexts. But most importantly, it is about the interfaces between these things. So what's in between these circles? And in between we have perceptions, we have relationships, and we also have flows. Flows of knowledge, flows of power, flows of information. And global education is concerned with both these perceptions, these relationships, and these flows. And these perceptions and relationships are grounded in different ways of being, knowing, and seeing in the world. So between the self and the other, there are differences. And between the self in the world, how we relate to the world. People relate to the world in different ways. So we relate it in different ways that others might relate to it. So it's important to try to understand how these different perceptions, relationships, and flows influence the way we see ourselves, we see the world, and we see our connections with each other. Now, of course, this is not something that has been outside of education. Many different strands of education have dealt with these three dimensions. But what makes it more important today in relation to the urgency of global education is that this is happening in a context of globalization. And I define globalization here drawing on Sharon Todd, where she says that globalization is related to rampant capitalism, vast international migration, ecological fragility, technological interconnectivity, cultural hybridity, and reconfiguration of political power. Now, different types of education have tried to deal with these different things and these different dimensions in different ways. For example, sustainable education, human rights education, development education, and peace education are relation to the dimension of how we relate to the world, in the same way that ethics education, values education, moral education, intercultural education, and multicultural education are related to how we relate to each other. And education about identity, national cultures, power, privilege, and global citizenship are more related to the dimension of the self. So global education combines all these elements together. So all these different dimensions of education and types of education are combined in a concept that can perhaps express both the complexity and the diversity within the field itself. And I often say that global education, global education in short for me, is education that prepares people to deal with 5 different things in society. The first thing is complexity, increasing complexity. The second is increasing uncertainty. The third one is increasing plurality. The fourth one is increasing context dependency, the idea that one model, one thing is not going to fit all contexts. So context dependency or contingency is the fourth dimension. And the last dimension is increasing inequality. So global education is about equipping people to engage in societies today that have increasing complexity, increasing uncertainty, increasing plurality, increasing contingency, and increasing inequality. So how do we deal with that? And it's based on the premise that the education we have had in the past has not taught us very well to deal with these things that are increasing right now. So education needs to change to be able to shape society in different ways. Now, education, global education is again, not new. Since the 70s, people have been talking about it, and it has changed a bit over the years. But I've got a very good historical text that was published in 1982 that is part of your literature. It's part of your reading for this module that is, I think, still very relevant. It's a very well-written text that talks about global perspectives, the need for global perspectives. And then he divides this global perspective idea into 5 different concepts. The concept of perspective consciousness, the idea that we need an awareness of the state of the planet. Cross-cultural awareness is also important. The knowledge of global dynamics is very crucial, and awareness of human choices. So I do invite you to read this text, having in mind that it was written in 1982, to have a historical perspective of the field of global education as an emerging academic field too. And in our conversations here, we're going to try to bring together the theory and the practice, because theory without practice is kind of useless, really, but the practice without an account of the theory behind it, because every practice has got a theory behind it. Practice without theory is also blind. So I know that there is a pressure for teachers to come up with new practices, but this course is about thinking about both together, that practice cannot live without theory. Theory always has an implied practice, and we're going to try to bring the two together in the course. And to start our conversation, I would like to invite you to think about education in more general terms, so that we can see what the relevance of these concepts are for the children that we have in our classrooms today. So I'm going to invite you to remember when you were 8 years old and try to compare the kind of world that you have around you, that you had around you at the time, with the world that an 8-year-old living in a city has around him or her today. So think about a child in a school today in a city, and think about your own childhood, and try to come up with ideas about what could be different and what could be similar. That's my invitation. So if you want to pause the presentation, this is a good time to do it. Now, when I started to engage with this question, I started to read the literature about children in the 21st century, or children in contemporary societies. And I did that mainly because I had two of my own who were challenging me with many things that they were doing that I didn't feel I had been prepared by my education to be able to face. Of course, as mothers and fathers, there's no book telling you how to deal with these things, and as society changes, we have to improvise and make mistakes. But I was interested to see what the literature was saying about it. And I was approaching this literature critically too. I didn't believe everything that I read, and that's, I think, the right attitude towards the literature. But some of the things that I saw in the literature really challenged me to think about things differently. So I have here a list of things that really got me thinking about the lives of my children, or in my students in the classroom too, and my own role as a teacher. So here's my list. One of the things that really challenged me was the idea that for this 8-year-old today, 80% of the knowledge that this child will need when he or she is 18 years old has not even been thought of yet. So if this is true, what is my role as a teacher? Because in the past, when I was 8 years old, I remember that the teachers had a pretty good idea of most of the knowledge that I would need when I was 18. And they knew it was more certain what they had to teach. But now knowledge is changing so fast that we are not certain anymore. So as a teacher, what can I do? What changes for me if I want to help this child cope with a world that doesn't exist yet? So that was the first thing. The second thing was Google. If I need an answer to a question, I Google it. I know there are many perspectives on any issue. So that was very challenging as well, and that's to do with my daughter. I could verify that in my own family. My daughter was brought up with a very multicultural family with many different religions, and at one point the two grandmothers were with religions that believed in different things, and they were living with us. So at one point they were kind of fighting over the children to tell them what was the truth. And I had to tell them, Giovanna was 5, my daughter was 5. I said, look, you can talk about religion with the children, but you cannot say that only your truth is valid. You cannot, because otherwise the family will break. So you can say that this is your perspective and that there are other perspectives on this. But they agreed. So Giovanna knew that whenever there was a problem or an issue that she had to solve, the grandmother number one would see it in one way, grandmother number two would see it in another way, and then she would ask, "What do you think, Mom?" And Dad, "What do you think?" And she would ask her brother as well. So she knew that there were different perspectives. And I thought that it was great until one day I told her, "Okay, young lady, go to bed now. It's 9:30 and you need to go to bed because it's time to go to bed." And then she turned to me and she said, "That's your perspective." There are many different ideas about this. And she wanted to renegotiate. So in many ways, I think, in that sense, as a teacher and as a mother, my authority as a knower and my position to impart knowledge and rules is also challenged by the idea that Google gives them that there are many perspectives on anything. And there are. But they need to also understand that in certain contexts, certain perspectives are better than others, or that people might define certain perspectives as better than others. And sometimes you can negotiate, sometimes you can't. And that's part of the learning as well that I found for myself. I'm still learning with that though. The next one is, my mind is trained to interact with virtual games and I get bored easily. So there's a lot of research in favor of virtual games, saying that they are very good for people. Of course, the violent ones, there's much more controversy about those, but in general, you can find a lot of research on educational technology that says that video games actually teach children things that the schools are not being able to teach, and that are going to be very important for their work life in the future. On the other hand, there's also a lot of research saying that video games also are very limiting for children because they take away human interaction. They may get them addicted to this virtual environment, and it leads to depression and so on and so forth. So I think the crude reality of it is that the video games are there, the children have access to them. So we have to start thinking about the implications of the video games and the attention span of children when we are trying to make education more relevant anyway. So thinking about how this video game changes the way that they look at schools. I have lived in 6 different places and changed schools 5 times in 8 years. Again, there's research that says that this is a very positive thing that helps them develop resilience, adaptation skills, and things that they will really, really need in the future. And some other research that says that actually that doesn't help all the children. It's better for them to have one place, and so on and so forth. Now, it's still a debate. My children have traveled quite a lot, and they have been part of different systems, and there are advantages and disadvantages in that, and there are disadvantages and disadvantages of staying in one place as well. So at the end of the day, different families have different forms of living, and it would help the children who are moving and part of different families if teachers had an awareness of that and saw that there are advantages and disadvantages in any form of life. But in that sense, I think that what the research is predicting is that we will see more transience, we will see more mobility than what we have seen in the past. So it doesn't really help if the teachers feel annoyed if the children are coming and going, because this is not going to stop. This is going to continue. So the best thing to do then is to prepare ourselves to see that as a natural process and to help these children in the best possible way that we can in their own learning about transition, about resilience, and about adaptation. Next one. School is where I say what the teacher wants to hear. Real learning happens in other places. Again, as part of the internet and video games, some children might feel that the school has lost its value, that they go there to endure 5 hours having to look at us, the teachers, and having to write these boring things. But fun, joyful learning happens when they're on Facebook or when they're doing something more interactive. Now, how do we respond to that? How do we deal with this response from them? That's something that really made me stop and think about it, because I don't believe education should be only fun. The world and life is not just fun. Fun is important. It is important to have joy, but they will be challenged by life. Life won't be that easy for a lot of them, or for all of us. All of us will face difficulties, and it's part of the educational process to learn that, to learn the discipline, to face life, and to engage with life in positive ways, but also with resilience, and learn from the mistakes, learn from difficulties. So how do you do that when they're not willing to see learning as something that can and should be fun, but that sometimes is not fun, or that sometimes is difficult? So how do we deal with that? The next one is, I will have had around 36 jobs by the time I'm 40. Again, when I was growing up, my parents wanted me to have one job as a civil servant so that I could have stability for life and a good pension. Right now, the idea of work is changing under market forces, which is really worrying and a reason for concern, even for global education. But the probable fact is that they are not going to have just one job. So how do we prepare them to have many different jobs and to have that kind of flexibility? The world looks pretty messed up. How did you adults allow it to be like that? So there's a bit of mistrust in relation to our adult ability to deal with the mess of the world. Children are exposed to more negative information about the world than we were in the past. So how do we respond to that? How do we undo the mistrust and address the complexity with them? Not creating naive hope, but creating a kind of hope that understands that things are not going to change overnight, but that it is possible to change, and they have a place in changing things too. I sometimes find it difficult to relate to other people and to understand my own feelings. So the issue of emotional literacy is something that the research that I was reading for this says that they can pick it up not only in themselves, but in the adults as well. So we are telling them, be nice to each other, when they can pick it up that in the staff room, we are not being nice to each other either as adults. So how do we align this emotional literacy so that we can be better prepared to deal with the complexities of life in our own work environment, and they can pick it up from us, not by telling them, but by seeing more balanced teachers, which I understand, I'm a teacher as well, is extremely difficult if you have increasing pressures in terms of workload and just the stress of the complexity of the classroom environments. But I would like to keep that as something that we do need to think about when we're thinking about making education more relevant for the current generation. I often look for a sense of security in my peer groups rather than my own sense of self. Now, here it's a tricky one, because education has this tradition of working on getting children to be compliant with what we want as teachers for them to do. But at some point, this backfires and they start to be compliant on what their peers, their peer group pressure becomes more important than teacher pressure, and we lose them to the peers. So how can we teach the children to work in group and to be in a community, but also understand that their value needs to come from inside out, not outside in. Their sense of security needs to be in the value that they feel in themselves, not as a kind of a selfish and hedonistic thing that they want to be very egotistical and individualistic, but that they know that they have an intrinsic value in themselves, and they are going to be heard. Their voice is not going to be the most important voice all the time. They need to understand that too, but that they are not worthless beings, and that they don't need this outside validation to feel good about themselves. So that would be an important thing that I see, and I see that in my daughter, in the pressure in relation to body image, in relation to fashion, in relation to having to comply with things that are demanded of her, and the difficulty to be different and to say, no, I'm deciding to go a bit against the tide in this circumstance. So I would like to see what we can do as educators to have her not need so much external validation to feel good about herself. So my question here would be, what can you do for me as an educator? Is there anything that you can help me with if I'm an 8-year-old living in a city today? So when I looked at I continue to look at the literature on 21st century education, one of the solutions proposed was that there was a need to reconceptualize knowledge and learning. So this is part of broader educational reform. This has been taken up. So our new documents, new curriculum, already talk about that. So recent theoretical arguments related to societal changes in the knowledge society and postmodernity emphasize the need for a reconceptualization of knowledge and learning in educational policies and practices in contemporary 21st century societies. And this idea has influenced the curriculum. But what does it mean in practice to reconceptualize knowledge and learning? I'm going to give you a few examples, and you'll see that if you agree at least that there is the possibility of a reconceptualization. I'm not saying that the reconceptualization should necessarily be a good thing in all cases, but I'm saying that if we don't understand that there is another possibility of meaning, we won't be able to see the possibility that knowledge can be reconceptualized. So I'm drawing on the work of Jane Gilbert in the article that you also have in your folder, for the reading folder. But the article is based on a book that she wrote in 2005. And both in the article and in the book, she makes a distinction between two different ideas about knowledge. The first idea is that knowledge is a noun. It exists out there and can be discovered. It's a collection of facts. It develops to be stored, and it's accumulated. It's also passive. And on the other side, we have knowledge as a verb. It is socially constructed. It's a collection of interrelated ideas. It develops to be replaced, and it does things. So you have these two different ideas of knowledge that come with two different metaphors. The metaphor of knowledge as a noun is like knowledge is milk that you put in a jug, and you're trying to put it in the minds of the students, which is another jug, and you measure it in tests and exams. So knowledge is content, knowledge is milk. And you have the idea that knowledge is a verb. It's a process of weaving. You weave knowledge with different people in a specific context for a specific thing. And Jane Gilbert says that knowledge as content was a characteristic of industrial societies in the 20th century, but 21st century societies in post-industrial periods will need more of the other knowledge. And she's arguing that education should be trying to teach students about more of the other knowledge, not so much the red. So we're going to be talking about red and yellow here. So more of the yellow knowledge, not the red knowledge. More verb than noun. I don't agree completely with her. I understand. I like the idea that there are two ideas of knowledge. But just in terms of the 20th century and the 21st century, this is just one idea of thinking about time. The knowledge as a verb may be useful for certain things. Knowledge as a noun may be useful for other things. And knowledge as a verb has actually been around for a long time. Indigenous cultures have been using that for a long, long time. So it's not new. Now, there are processes that were created by the red tendency. If you have too much of one or too much of the other, there are usually problems. But the red tendency has also created some problems where the yellow kind of knowledge has not been able to express itself. So what I will invite you to do here is to think about these two concepts for some time, for 5 minutes. See if you can remember them on your own, because I'm going to have a quiz for you next, where we're going to look at different concepts and ask ourselves, is this a noun or a verb, yellow or red? So you need to really remember what the associations in this slide to be able to do that. So see if you can remember that red is associated with milk and is associated with noun, and that yellow is associated with weaving and is associated with a verb. So you can pause the film now. Okay. So our first quiz. So here you have two understandings of society. The first one says society is something to be fixed into one normative order, which creates the desire for certainty, consensus, and harmony. One lens. And on the other hand, you have society as a complex system characterized by multiple and always changing ideas of what is real and ideal, which are constructed by different communities. There are multiple lenses. So this is a kind of a silly quiz, but just to illustrate the point that there are often different ideas about these things, not just these two, but more. And the idea here is to ask you, is this red? Is the one on the right red or yellow? And why? Where does it come from? Which one is the most dominant in your context? And what are the implications of that for education? So I'll ask you to be asking these questions every time we do the quiz, and you can stop, pause the video if you want to discuss it before I show you the right answer, which can be also discussed. There's no right or wrong. You can actually argue this both ways if you want to. Okay, so there's one way of justifying the red as the first one and the yellow the second, because of some of the words that are in the boxes, but there are also ways of arguing in a different way. But the point here is not whether it's red or yellow, it's where do these ideas come from and what are the implications for education. So I'm going to ask you, if you wanted to teach about development, for example, and progress, if you teach from the red perspective, what kinds of activities and what kind of thinking and ideas would you have about development? If you think about it or teach about it through the yellow perspective, what else is possible? And I would like to suggest that if you're thinking about development from the red perspective strictly, then you're going to have one idea about development that is very linear, that already knows the end of it. Whereas if you're teaching about development through the yellow perspective, it's going to be much more multiple. You're going to be questioning what development is all the time, which then opens up to ideas of other cultures about what development could mean. And also about the need to look at the implications of imposing one notion of development on everybody. Okay. The second quiz is related to answers. So on the one hand, you have answers are always partial, provisional, and context dependent, versus answers are right or wrong, independent of the context. So if you want to pause. So here is my provisional answer. And what I'd like to ask is, why do you think it's yellow or red? But also, what implications there are for intercultural education if you're teaching from the yellow or from the red. The next quiz is about consensus. On the one hand, you have consensus as the elimination of difference is the only desirable outcome of conversations, and clashes of perspectives or conflict need to be resolved. Versus consensus is desirable in certain contexts, not in others. The capacity to live with and learn from dissensus is a key competency which requires seeing conflict as an opportunity for learning. Do you want to pause? And here I would like you to consider the implications of teaching for peace education from both perspectives. So what would peace education look like if we want consensus to be the major moving force towards peace? And what would it look like if we want the yellow kind of perspective to be the driving force behind peace education? The next one, identities are stable and based on cumulative, innate, or learned attributes related to culture, nationality, or ethnicity, versus identities are socially constructed and context dependent, and therefore multiple and open to reconstruction and negotiation. So identities are fluid. Pause. And again here, what are the implications for multicultural education if you teach it from the red and if you teach it from the yellow perspective? What do you teach about identity if you teach it from the red or if you teach it from the yellow? And what are the implications for the children of these two perspectives? Then learning. On the one hand, we have learning as the transmission or construction of already known knowledge, and on the other hand, we have learning as the negotiation of meaning and the creation of knowledge, the weaving of different threads together for a specific purpose. Pause. So what are the implications for this in terms of ethics? So what are the ethics of learning or teaching? What are the ethics of teaching from a red perspective? What are the ethics of teaching from a yellow perspective? How would you see your students? How do you see yourself? How do you see your role? And also, where would the red perspective be best placed in the educational process? Where would the yellow perspective be best placed in the educational process? And the last one is teacher education. Is teacher education about preparing students to reproduce existing best practices, or is teacher education about preparing students to respond to the changing needs of diverse learners and societies for next practices? So what are the implications here of a red and yellow perspective for teacher education? And here, I'm not suggesting that we have actually to choose between red and yellow. Maybe the best question is, when is the red perspective justified and relevant for teacher education, and when is the yellow perspective not necessary, justified, and relevant for teacher education? And the point here is not as I said before, not really about the choice, but understanding that there are different possibilities for us to think with. Now, I'm going to try to summarize that in a table. So, in the roles, we have two kinds of education. Education 1, think as I do, do as I say. Education 2, think for yourself and choose responsibly what to do. And we have one right answer representing the red perspective, or possibilities dependent on context representing the yellow perspective. And then 4 different kinds of education. Education A, think as I do as I say, there is only one right answer. Education B, there are many possibilities, but here in my class, you should think as I do and do as I say. Education C, you should think for yourself and choose responsibly what to do as long as you arrive at my answer. And education D, which can be interpreted in 2 ways. Education D could be interpreted as there are many answers and any answer is a good answer, which is one interpretation. And the other interpretation is that students will have to face these many answers in society anyway. So my role as a teacher is not to say that any answer is a good answer, but to prepare them to deal with this complexity and this dilemma. So my role is to expose them to the complexities and help them develop the skills to deal with the plurality, complexity, contingency, uncertainty, and inequality of what they are going to face outside the school. It's a very different role from just accepting whatever the students say, from the idea that it's everything goes. Any answer is a good answer. So the table shows that I'm not saying that D is better than A, B, and C. What I'm saying is that if you think about education including D, you are going to see A, B, and C differently, because then you can choose what to do depending on the context. If I had to teach you how to do CPR, like resuscitation, in only 5 minutes, I would probably choose A. But to choose A, I would have to forget that there are many ways of doing CPR. And I would also have to forget that when you have to do it yourself, you will have to think on your feet and to think for yourself and choose responsibly what to do. But if I choose to do it in only 5 minutes and I choose A, I know it's a choice. And I know that I have to forget these other things, but I cannot forget I have forgotten those things. So I will be able to go back to these things when I have more time. I know what I'm not doing. I'm not thinking to myself, this is the only thing that I can do. I know there are more possibilities, and that I'm choosing to do one because of the context. That's why I think D is so important for our education today. And that's one of the reasons too that I feel that if we have too much A, we are going to have teachers and students who will want one right answer. And if we don't have the one right answer to give them, they will feel very frustrated because they haven't been exposed enough to D. And that's why it's important to include more D in our educational system. So that's a perspective that I put it out there for you to discuss. Now, my last exercise is to invite you to think about what predispositions, competencies, and knowledges would teachers need to deal with the complex, or to deal themselves with the complexity, uncertainty, plurality, contingency, and inequality of society, and to help their students do the same. So I'll invite you to draft a list of these predispositions, competencies, and knowledges to compare with each other and to see what kinds of things you have received already in your practice and teacher education, and what kinds of things would global education be able to offer you in order to make education more relevant for contemporary learners. So if you want to pause, that's a good time. And my last slide is about the reading. So these are the 3 readings that I have suggested for you. The first one is called Global Learning in the Knowledge Society, and it goes a bit deeper in the kinds of exercises we have done today. Then we have Gilbert's article, which is very short and very engaging, I think, about catching the knowledge wave, redefining knowledge for the post-industrial age. We have Henvey, which is the historical text called An Attainable Global Perspective. And then I have included some resources in your summary. And I'm sure that you will have more resources too related to that. One of the resources is the Global Education booklet. It's an explanation about what global education is from a perspective from an educator from New Zealand who created this booklet, and I think it's very useful and very interesting. It's not the only perspective, but it's a very interesting perspective, and it's called Global Education: Transforming the World Through Community Education. I've also included in your resource pack links to websites with many activities for the children to do. So if you want to try something in the classroom, there are also resources in these two websites. Unfortunately, they are in English, but I'm sure that you can creatively adapt and translate part of it and adapt them to your own contexts of work. It was a pleasure being with you for this time. We'll see each other again very soon in the future. Thank you.